Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Center's Deputy Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk by Riordan Frost on whether more people moved during the pandemic. Before I introduce Riordan, I have two announcements. First, on Friday, March 18th at 12:15 p.m., Jenny Schutz, a fellow at the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program, will be speaking, online only, about her provocative new book, Fixer Upper: How to Repair America's Broken Housing Systems. We'll then have a discussion that will include Christian Dorsey, who is Vice Chair of the Arlington, Virginia County Board and Chair of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, has been trying to put some of Jenny's ideas into practice. Then, a week later, at 6:30 p.m. on Thursday, March 24th, we'll kick off a two-day symposium titled Bringing Digitalization Home: How Can Technology Address Housing Challenges, with a keynote lecture by Molly Wright Steenson, who, among other things, is a professor of ethics and computational technology at Carnegie Mellon University and the author of Architectural Intelligence: How Designers and Architects Created the Digital Landscape. We'll continue on Friday and half of Saturday with a series of panel discussions that not only will examine how digitalization, notably big data and advanced analytics, is changing all aspects of housing, but also will assess whether those changes are or could help address a variety of housing-related challenges, such as affordability, inequality, segregation, and climate change. Should be a fascinating event. Symposium will be hybrid. However, in keeping with current university policies, the in-person portion, which will be at the Graduate School of Design, currently is open only to Harvard students, faculty, and staff. More information about the symposium, Jenny's talks, and other upcoming events is available on our website, www.jchs.harvard.edu. Now on to today's presentation. Riordan Frost is a senior research analyst here at the Joint Center, where he works on projects on a variety of topics, including demographics, residential mobility, utilities, wealth inequality, and homelessness. Riordan will be talking today about whether more Americans actually wound up moving during the pandemic, and if so, who moved, where they left, where they went, or at least what we can figure out from the data we have. He described some of this work in our housing research blog late last year. His work also greatly informed the discussions about households that were a key part of our recent report on America's rental housing. Riordan will talk for about 30 to 35 minutes. I'll then moderate a Q&A that will draw on questions that I encourage you to submit via Zoom's Q&A feature. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your questions. A video of the talk, along with Riordan's slides, will be posted on the Center's website by early next week. Riordan, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, David. Appreciate that. Let me share my screen here with you. And great. David, can you see those slides?
Yes.
Great. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here. As David mentioned, my name is Riordan Frost. I'm a senior research analyst at the Center, and there's a lot to get into here about mobility during the pandemic, so I just want to dive right in. So there we are. So inspired by a slide I once saw at a conference called Too Long Didn't Listen, or TLDL, inspired by the Too Long Didn't Read phrase. The key takeaways here I want to just tell you up front, and I'll show this slide again at the end after I've gone through a lot of this information in detail. So were there pandemic-related spikes in mobility? Yes. Did more people move during the pandemic than before the pandemic? Not really. So a lot of the pandemic-related spikes in mobility were concentrated among individuals and temporary moves, but otherwise during pandemic mobility has really hewed to pre-pandemic trends. Those trends include a long-term decline in mobility, especially among young adults, an out-migration from cities to suburbs, Sun Belt metros continuing to attract movers, and then large high-cost metros continuing to lose movers. So those are all pre-pandemic trends that have continued during the pandemic. However, I don't want to diminish the fact that there have been impacts of permanent and temporary moves during the pandemic, even though it's been similar to pre-pandemic trends overall. There have been big changes to housing markets. There have been population change, employment changes, a lot of other changes in a lot of different places around the country. And I also want to note that new data may yet reveal more changes and different trends because we only have some, kind of USPS data and CPS data up to 2021, but more data in the future may reveal new changes and trends. So why are we here today? We are here because of the kind of sudden widespread interest in residential mobility, because of what appeared to be a really, really big bump in migration in 2020 after the pandemic began. So the Washington Post article on the left here shows, they call it the Great American Migration of 2020. This article was written in just late March of 2020, talking about all the people fleeing kind of dense urban areas for small rural areas to get away from the risk of spread of COVID. And then on the right here is a Pew Research Center paper that shows that is talking about a June 2020 survey showing that about a fifth of US adults either moved because of COVID-19 or know somebody who did. So what this has resulted in is a lot of conflicting narratives about mobility. So on the left here, you have a Brookings report about how Americans are moving at historically low rates. And on the right, you have an NBC News article talking about how millions of Americans moved during the pandemic and the faces of America's cities and neighborhoods have been forever changed. So it's worth pausing to just note here that both of these can be true, especially because the one on the left is talking about mobility rates and the one on the right is just saying millions of Americans. It is the case that millions of Americans moved. It's just that a lot more millions of Americans didn't move. And it is also the case that this has affected places across the country. And one of the places that has been talked about a lot in terms of mobility is New York City. And I like to kind of poke fun at a friend of mine who said in summer of 2020, after fleeing New York for New Hampshire, that New York is over. And that has been kind of a common narrative among kind of media narratives about mobility during the pandemic. Cities are over. This is now the age of suburbs or of rural areas or vacation towns or whatever it may be. And then on the right here, you see a comptroller report talking about migration in and out of New York and how it actually has since recovered. And that friend of mine who said this quote on the left is indeed now living back in New York City. So I'll talk more about this comptroller report later because it's really interesting, but I just wanted to put these up as a kind of example of how these narratives are conflicting about what is happening to mobility during the pandemic. So I will get into pandemic mobility very, very shortly, but first I want to just get everybody on the same page about what mobility looks like. What was pre-pandemic residential mobility in terms of who was moving, where were they moving, and why were they moving? And I have a little section note here on the right for those following along to just see where we're kind of at in the talk as we go. So who moved in 2019? Using American Community Survey data, we see about 13% of Americans moved, and that mobility declines with age. Young adults are about 4 times more likely to move than older adults. That's what the chart on the right here shows. Renter households move much more often. About a quarter of renter households moved in 2019 compared to about 6% of homeowner households. And mobility also declines with income. So in the bottom household income quartile, there's about a 15% mobility rate, and in the top household income quartile, there's about a 9% mobility rate. So it gives you a general idea of who moved. Now, in terms of where people moved, this is using current population survey data, again, from 2019. I have more recent current population survey data, but again, I'm just trying to show a pre-pandemic picture of mobility. And so what you see here is that a vast majority of moves in 2019 were within county. This is the 65% kind of teal color here. And so that's really the vast majority of moves. When we're talking about mobility, we are often talking about local mobility like that. And what people often think about when they think about mobility are the most impactful moves in their lives, maybe the most emotional moves in their lives. They're moving long distances. But when you're talking about just who is moving from residence to residence every year, we're talking about local moves primarily. So about 17% of moves in 2019 were within states. So those are between counties, across county lines, but not across state lines. And then about 14% are between states, and then about 4% were from abroad. So then why did people move in 2019? So CPS has some really interesting reasons for moving data, and it shows us that the most common reason, though not the majority, is housing. That's about 40% of moves in 2019. And then jobs are about 20% of moves. Family was about a quarter of moves, and other about 10%. And on the right here, I show just some examples. This is not an exhaustive list, but just some examples of these reasons within the categories. So housing includes new or better housing, transitioning home ownership, family, change in marital status, the big one, job, getting a new job, moving for a better commute. And then other contains quite a large list, including moving in with an unmarried partner, moving with friends, attending college, et cetera. So then you can also see that reasons for moving differed by type of move. So here I'm defining local move on the left as within state, and then I'm defining long distance as between states or from abroad. And what you see here is local moves are really driven primarily by housing and then next by family, but long distance moves are driven much more by jobs and then next by family after that. And it's not as common really to move long distance for a housing related reason. So if we step back and think about the fact that local moves are the most common type of move and housing moves are the most common motivation for moves, moving locally for a housing related reason is the most common. So if you kind of drill into that, just looking at local moves, just looking at housing reasons, you can see this kind of just deeper dive. And this is just to give a sense of, you know, the most common type of move and how that kind of breaks down in terms of the housing reasons. Wanting new or better housing is the most common there. Transitioning home ownership, wanting cheaper housing, kind of equal weighted there. And then wanting a better neighborhood and foreclosure eviction kind of less common among that category. So it kind of gives you a basic idea. So now we can get into the stuff that everyone's really interested in, which is mobility during the pandemic. So first I'll talk about the data. I'm going to be using both current population survey data and USPS data. And so first I'll talk about the USPS data. And this data captures when people file for a change of address with the Postal Service. So you can go to the Postal Service website. The link is here at the bottom there to like change your address. You can go in person as well. And whenever you do that, you first have to select whether it's an individual moving, a family moving, or a business moving. And then later you have to select if it's a permanent or a temporary move. Temporary moves are up to 6 months and afterwards revert to the original address. Permanent moves do not revert to the original address. So these data are released monthly, which is really great. They've been released to the public since 2021, just last year. And they date back to 2017. So some historical data, including some pre-pandemic data, which is good, but nothing before 2017. It used to be the case that you had to file a Freedom of Information Act request to get this data, but then so many people did, they started releasing it to the public via the FOIA library. So I've linked to the FOIA library here. These slides will be shared afterwards, so you can get these slides and visit that link. So the other interesting thing about these data are that they are zip code level flows and not pairings. Before they started releasing things to the public, they would allow you to have pairings. So this many people move from this zip code to that zip code, but the data that they release publicly are just flows. So the example I give here is, you know, there were 274 temporary moves that started in 02138 in March of 2020. 02138 is the zip code where the Joint Center is located. So that's actual data, not really telling us anything, you know, right now, but just as an example of what that data actually looks like. And then the last thing I'll say about this data is that it shows you individual moves, family moves, and business moves, and then it separately shows you permanent and temporary moves. You cannot get into individual permanent versus individual temporary, unfortunately, but you can kind of discern what's going on based on the levels of these different things. So first, I'll talk about the permanent moves. So this chart is showing you 2019 in the blue line, 2020 in the dotted yellow line, and then 2021 in the dashed orange line. And what this is showing you, 2019 is kind of standing in for the pre-pandemic trends. I also have 2018 data that's quite similar to the 2019 trends, but I didn't include it in the spirit of not having this chart be too cluttered. So what you see here is in 2020, there's a spike in moves in March for permanent change of address requests. So these are moves that people say, I'm not going back to this address. So there's a spike in those moves in March of 2020, but then it actually goes down and then starts to follow kind of pre-pandemic monthly trends up until December of 2020 and January 2021 to a lesser extent. And then again, kind of in March of 2021, there's another kind of elevation from those pre-pandemic levels. But other than that, you see, especially in 2021, it's going back to kind of pre-pandemic monthly trends, but actually a little bit lower than pre-pandemic trends. So that's permanent change of address requests. Temporary change of address requests are much less common. So if you look back at permanent change of address requests, this is like 2 to 3.5 million every month. Temporary change of address requests are like 100 to 400,000 every month. But still, you see this huge spike in March and actually also in April of 2020. And then it kind of goes back to pre-pandemic trends, but is a little elevated, unlike the permanent where it was kind of below pre-pandemic trends. The temporary trends are elevated from pre-pandemic trends. And you see a slight increase in March of 2021 as well, but otherwise 2021 actually almost completely mirrors the 2019 pre-pandemic trends. So if you add all these up, and now I can add 2018 in because it won't be too cluttered because it's a different chart. If you add all these up, you can look at annual totals for permanent change of address requests and temporary change of address requests. So on the left here, you see the permanent change of address requests really only went up about 1% and then fell actually by 4% between 2020 and 2021. So just a small overall increase in permanent moves and then a decrease to actually below pre-pandemic levels. Temporary moves were a bit more dramatic. There was an 18% increase between 2019 and 2020, but then there was a decrease of about 13% from 2020 to 2021. And so again, I should note that all of these are including individual, family, and business moves, but individual moves, as I'll show in just a minute, are about 20 million a year. Family moves are about 10 million a year, and then business moves are only about 1 million a year. So business moves are definitely playing a little bit of a role, but not really driving what we're seeing here. So these are mostly individual moves that we're seeing and family moves to a lesser extent. So to get into that specifically, here's individual moves. So this is going to be both permanent and temporary individual moves combined. And we have about 1.5 to 2.5 million every month. And again, you see this spike in March and April of 2020, and then back to kind of the pre-pandemic trends up until that spike again in late 2020, December 2020 and January 2021, and then another spike in March of 2021. And so to take a brief tangent, I wanted to show this chart that my colleague Dan McHugh made for a March 2021 blog about young adults moving with their parents. And just as more evidence of these kind of mobility spikes, both in early and in late 2020. So the orange line here is showing you 2020. The blue line is showing you 2019, and it's showing 18 to 24-year-old full-time college students, the share of them living in their parents' homes. So 2020 had a big increase in the share of these young adults living with their parents. And specifically, it was around March and April that this really increased, stayed at elevated rates for a while, and then went down again in the kind of late summer and then fall, and then actually went up again in December. So this could be kind of one of the things that we're seeing in that, but also, you know, there might be a lot of college students that don't file change of address requests, and so we might not be seeing all of this in the change of address data. So getting back to the change of address data, getting back to the USPS here, and looking at family moves, what we see here is, I think, really, really interesting, which is that there was a tiny little elevation in family change of address requests in 2020, but after that, they actually went below pre-pandemic trends and then stayed below pre-pandemic trends. So family moves actually became less common during the pandemic. And what that tells me is, it tells me, you know, that the people who are kind of more in a position to be able to pack up and move, i.e. people who are moving as individuals, were able to and then did so. And then families were probably more likely to hunker down because they were less able to move. So this is what you see when you add up the annual totals for individual moves and for family moves. As I mentioned, individual moves about 20 million a year, and it went up by about 5% between 2019 and 2020, but then between 2020 and 2021, it actually declined by about 5%. And then when you look at family moves, it did not increase at all in 2020, which I think is really remarkable given that all of these other types of moves did increase. And you actually see a 7% decrease in family moves between 2019 and 2020, and then a 2% increase in 2% decrease in 2021. So how do these trends fit into the historic trends in mobility? So I will be using current population survey data to answer this question. And a brief kind of bit about the current population survey is that it's conducted by the Census Bureau. It's a monthly survey that has an annual social and economic supplement that's collected every March. So that's the one that contains kind of all the mobility information as well as a bunch of other information. And so that's conducted every March, and data collection for 2020 and 2021 were definitely affected by the pandemic. Response rates are a bit higher for 2021 than they were for 2020. So I try to rely on 2021 data a bit more, but there is still some evidence of bias in 2021, specifically underrepresentation of lower income respondents. I have a link here that when you get the slides, you can go to that links to a Census Bureau kind of article about that. Also, I did show some American Community Survey data earlier. So what about that? It is typically the most reliable source of data on residential mobility. I typically love to use the ACS, but data collection was really severely impacted by the pandemic in 2020. And the Census Bureau released the 2020 data with experimental weights and cautions not to compare it to previous years. So I do not do so here. So pandemic mobility rates have continued a long-term decline. This is CPS data, and this is showing you that back in the 80s, it was close to 20% of people were moving. And in 2020, 2021, it's actually less than 10%. So that's less than the ACS percentage I showed you earlier. In 2019, the CPS has slightly lower rates, but similar trends overall. But the CPS is showing us less than 10% of people moving every year in 2021, and really that being a continuation of trends that we've seen. So what's driving this is the decline in local mobility. So I actually kept these y-axes the same at 20%, so you could see how much local mobility is really driving overall mobility. And again, local mobility I'm defining here as within states, so it's either within or between county within a state. And you see that this has also continued to decline, and in 2020 and 2021, that trend has just continued. So interstate migration is interesting. It's less common, as I mentioned earlier. In 2019, it was about 15% of all moves. So the interstate migration rate is only about 1 to 4% over the past few decades. And it's also definitely been in a decline, but it seems to have kind of plateaued in the past decade, and then declined a little bit recently, and then it ticked up in 2021. Whether that is a blip or whether that will continue when we have more data will be really interesting to see. So this long-term mobility decline has really been the sharpest among young adults, and this has been across generations. This is 5-year age groups in all of these different years, and you can see that young adults in 2006 moved less than those in the 1990s, moved less than those in the 1980s, et cetera. So this has been across age groups and across generations that this mobility rate has declined. And again, local mobility is driving this. I kept these y-axes the same again, so you could see how much is local mobility. And in 2021, the last column in each section, you can see that this decline has continued across ages. Interstate migration, I've changed the y-axis here because it's so much less common, and it's been a bit more nuanced by age, and 2021 has shown some interesting changes here. Still some declines like among the 25 to 29-year-olds, but some age groups have it kind of plateauing between 2016 and 2021, and some actually have it increasing. But you still see overall that people are moving across state lines much less than they did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So renter mobility, this is CPS data showing renter household mobility specifically from 1999 to 2021, and just showing every other year to have fewer bars on the chart here. And it really shows this kind of free fall in renter mobility. And it shows, this both the number of renters moving and the rate have been declining. And this is interesting because in the past decade, the number of renter households has been growing, but the number who've been moving has still been declining every year. And then homeowner mobility, as I mentioned earlier, is much lower than renter mobility. So it's about 4% here in 2021 compared to about 16% in 2021 for renters. And it did recover a little bit after the recession, but it's still much lower than it was in the 1990s. And 2021 has really, it's not much of a decline based on compared to 2019, but it is kind of a plateau there. So it'll be interesting to see if that increases, especially as homeownership in the housing market has given what's been happening in the housing market. So what about where people are moving? I'm specifically kind of interested here in the types of places people are moving in addition to the actual metros. And in this section, I'm really going to share some other interesting research that has been happening, either with data that I don't have access to, or using the data that I've shown here, but in different interesting ways, and a lot of really cool research, including a paper by Stephen Whitaker from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, who used the Consumer Credit Panel to look at migration in and out of urban census tracts specifically. So as a tangent there, kind of defining urban as large metro areas with either a high population density or an older housing stock. And this Consumer Credit Panel is not data I have access to, sadly. It's only available to Federal Reserve Bank researchers and their co-authors. So if any Federal Reserve Bank researchers are in the audience and would like to co-author with me and share this data, I would be very appreciative. But this is a nationally representative sample of consumers with a credit file. Because it's consumers with a credit file, it kind of underrepresents some lower income people and some young adults. But it tracks addresses based on what lenders have available to them. And then you can look at mobility that way. And so what Whitaker found was that looking at these urban census tracts specifically, there was a huge spike in the net outflow from these urban census tracts in 2020. And so there's two things I want to point out here. One is that if you look at 2010 to 2020, there is a gradual increase in net outflow from urban census tracts already before the pandemic. And then there's this huge spike in 2020, and then it falls in kind of 2021, but it's still much higher than it was before the pandemic. And probably the most interesting thing about this research to me is that he breaks out outflow from inflow and shows that the spike in 2020 was actually more driven by inflow going down sharply rather than outflow going up sharply. And that kind of changed a little bit later in 2021. But it was actually in that early days, it was that fewer people were moving into urban neighborhoods rather than more people were moving out. And then outflow continued to increase, but inflow actually recovered a little bit. And then both of them kind of leveled off there. So circling back to this comptroller report from New York that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I really wanted to get more into this because New York has been a huge focus of mobility during the pandemic, as has other places like San Francisco. And the comptroller really looked at the USPS data and just at New York zip codes, and then did kind of a by borough analysis, permanent versus temporary move analysis. And what you see here on the right on the top chart is that temporary moves before the pandemic were kind of a net zero, the same amount of people temporary moving out of New York as into New York. And then permanent moves before the pandemic were negative net, so that's net outflow out of New York, which is similar to other trends that we've seen with net outflow from cities. And then during the pandemic, the temporary moves really spiked before kind of coming back to pre-pandemic normals in 2021. And then permanent moves had a bit of a delay, but also spiked and have started getting back to that same, again, negative territory, but that same negative territory in 2021. And so what's really interesting about this is the second chart here that shows residential moves by borough. And what you see here is that moves really spiked in Manhattan and to a lesser extent in Brooklyn, but not in Queens and Staten Island and the Bronx nearly as much. And so that brings me to this quote that's on the left here, which is the comptroller saying that residents in the wealthiest 10% of New York City neighborhoods were 4.6 times more likely to leave than other residents during 2020. So this is a really interesting thing to me because, you know, there's a lot of people that move temporarily and then people that move permanently. Some of those temporary moves may have become permanent moves. There definitely could be people that you know, move permanently out of Manhattan, but this is kind of showing us that it's more of a kind of wealthy people moving, people who have the opportunity to move to the Hamptons, to the Berkshires, to wherever, to like second homes, vacation homes, a lot of those being temporary moves, or moving out of the city entirely, having the resources to kind of do that during the housing markets of 2020 and 2021. Whereas a lot of these other boroughs have mobility rates that are quite similar. So I find that really interesting, and that kind of informs some of what may have been happening with during pandemic mobility. So getting back to this question of whether there's an urban exodus or trends are simply continuing, we have another Pew Research report here. They use current population survey and average pre-pandemic years and then post-pandemic. They say 2020 here, but it's actually using 2021 CPS data. They say that because it's whether you moved in the past year. So that's not how I label it, but they're using the same data that I am here. So this is 2021 CPS for 2020 moves, they're saying. And what you see here is that they're comparing, you know, the dark green is during pandemic, the light green is before pandemic, several years averaged there. And you see that basically all the trends are continuing in the same way that they were. So net outflow from cities is continuing, but actually at a slightly lesser pace. And then net outflow to suburbs, net inflow to suburbs is continuing, but actually at a slightly lower pace than before the pandemic. And then for rural areas, it's been pretty similar before the pandemic and during the pandemic. So then I also wanted to point out this really great New York Times analysis that showed kind of metro mobility and which places have net changes. Because I wanted to answer, you know, got to get at this question of, is the map of migration totally new? I've seen that narrative before where it's like, you know, where people are moving is totally different. The whole map is different. This has completely changed mobility forever. I think things have changed, but in terms of the metros that are gaining the most movers and the metros that are losing the most movers, a lot of that is the same. So what this is showing you as before the pandemic. So what this is showing you on the x-axis is net change in movers in 2019, and the y-axis is net change in movers in 2020. And then the diagonal line is if 2019 and 2020 were the same, all metros would be along this line. And you see that a lot of metros are clustered along that line, including ones that we talk about a lot, like Austin. Austin's basically gaining the same amount of movers in 2019 as it did in 2020. And then there are some outliers that have also made the news, like Boise, Idaho is gaining more people in 2020 than it gained in 2019. Same with Cape Coral, Florida, Sarasota, Florida. And then there's some places like New York, San Francisco, and San Jose that are losing, that lost more people in 2020 than they did in 2019. But this isn't, you know, the case that there's anybody in kind of these other quadrants where it completely changed. Everybody's pretty close to this line. So it's really showing you that a lot of during pandemic mobility has been pre-pandemic mobility accelerated, with a few notable changes that are really interesting and have really affected places like Boise, Idaho. But it's a lot of the kind of same mobility that we've seen before. So did reasons for moving change? I'm again going to pull from the Pew Research Center here. They did some really interesting surveys of their own in June and November of 2020, showing how reasons changed during the pandemic itself, reasons for moving. And so they found that for US adults who specifically moved due to COVID-19, that percentage kind of increased in late 2020. But more people cited as their most important reason financial reasons for moving rather than the risk of COVID-19, which they cited more in June of 2020. And fewer moving in with family in November of 2020, which matches that CPS chart that we saw earlier that my colleague Dan McHugh made. So that's some interesting stuff about during the pandemic, but what about before and versus during the pandemic? This is a chart that I showed on the left earlier, just about like why people are moving, CPS reasons for moving. And it's showing, you know, housing, family, job, and other in that order. And then what we see is that job reasons in 2021 became much less common. Housing reasons became more common. Family reasons became more common. And then if you look at the actual numbers for this, it's worth keeping in mind that mobility declined between 2019 and 2021. So it's actually not the case that there were more housing moves. It's just the case that job moves fell more than all of the other types of moves fell. So that's just kind of a note to between the percentages and the levels both provide some interesting information here. So housing and family reasons also played a bigger role in long distance moves. I just wanted to highlight this because it was very interesting that housing moves especially went up between 2019 and 2021, and then job moves kind of became less common. And again, if you look at the levels here, you see that housing moves are the ones that actually went up, but overall mobility went down. So all these other categories went down. It's just as their share of the overall mobility, they changed in this way. So that was a lot of information, about 42 slides worth. And so I just wanted to kind of revisit that headline slide that I showed you earlier, which is that there were indeed pandemic-related spikes in mobility, but these were, the evidence shows that these are kind of concentrated among individuals and temporary moves. During pandemic, mobility is really skewed to the pre-pandemic trends. Those trends include a long-term decline in mobility, especially among young adults, out-migration from cities to suburbs, Sunbelt metros continuing to attract movers, and large high-cost metros continuing to lose movers. But again, I don't want any of this to diminish or shadow the fact that there have really been impacts of these permanent and temporary moves on housing markets, on population change in different places, on employment, on a lot of things. So, the macro picture here sometimes obscures the smaller picture. So, those two articles that I showed earlier of Americans are moving at historically low rates and cities are changed forever, those can both be true, basically, in this. It's just that the overall, macro picture is that during pandemic trends are just a continuation of pre-pandemic trends and have not been enormously higher. And new data may yet reveal more changes. The really interesting thing about CPS is that that's from March of 2021. Vaccines were still being rolled out then. There may have been more kind of moving activity after that, and we saw the housing market again really improve and accelerate a lot in 2021. So it may be that we're going to start capturing more moves there and have more moves as we hopefully emerge from the pandemic. So thank you very much. This is my email and my Twitter handle. I am very receptive to any feedback, any questions, any discussion of these kind of trends. So with that, I will hand it back to David.
Thank you, Riordan. I'm still trying to digest all of this. Let me actually start out with a broad question. Do we have any sense why mobility rates overall have declined so dramatically? We're declining before the pandemic, and you've made a pretty persuasive argument that at least in very broad terms that those patterns really haven't changed. What do we think is going on?
Yeah, so there's a lot of possible answers. I think one answer that has been gaining traction recently, and there's a really interesting paper by Dal Myers and others that have really pointed to affordability being the main reason that local mobility especially has declined, because as I showed, local mobility is driving these overall mobility trends and has really declined quite sharply. And among renters, mobility has really declined. And so, what Dal Myers points out is that the affordability, especially kind of post-recession, has really kind of driven that decrease in mobility. But I think there's other factors at play, since we're looking at this from like the 1980s and how mobility has declined since then. And I think that there could be a variety of factors, including kind of like, a rise in dual earners. So it's harder to move for kind of job-related reasons. If there's two earners, both have jobs that need to be coordinated. And there's a lot of other things about kind of like, are there any generational effects? But you could see that mobility decline was actually across generations. So it wasn't just that millennials were moving less than everybody else. It was that millennials were moving less, Gen X was moving less, et cetera. So I think it could also, employment, I think, could play a role there as well, with the fact that, there are fewer kind of relocations for jobs. I've seen a little bit of data on that has shown that. So, and then, yeah, just the affordability question, though, I think is a really big factor.
I just want to stay on this affordability for a second. So the argument here is, or Dal's argument was, as affordability becomes a greater problem, it becomes harder to move. And because it seems to me you could make the other argument, right? Which is affordability becomes a problem. I have to move because my rent is going up too quickly. But it sounds like the data certainly doesn't seem to be showing that. Actually, let me repackage it a little bit, because there are a couple of questions about is there anything else we can say about mobility and income? You had shown early on that at least some moves historically have been more common among higher income folks. Sorry. Now your slides are. What do we know about mobility and income? Let me just leave it at that for a second.
Yeah. So what we know about mobility and income is that lower income people do move more often than higher income people. And if you look at it by type of mobility, the local mobility rates among lower income households are higher than they are for higher income households. But the interstate migration rates are actually basically the same for lower income and for higher income households. So they're like a greater proportion of higher income mobility, but basically the same between low income and high income households. So the affordability point, I think, is saying that as the housing stock isn't as available, is tighter and everything like that, people are more likely to stay put, or more likely to kind of double up with friends and stuff like that and stay put. And that we've actually seen during the pandemic as well. In looking at RealPage data that we researched for our rental housing report that we released in January, we saw that lease renewal rates were at a record high during the pandemic, and that people were really kind of hunkering down in their apartments as these rents were rising, and so that they could kind of lock in where their rents were at. So that has been an interesting thing as well to see during the pandemic, is that renter mobility has gone down because more people are kind of staying put in this phase of the pandemic, in the kind of 2021.
Is this? I'm thinking of, there's the New York story where for a while you couldn't give away an apartment, and there were all kinds of concessions, and then that very much seemed to have flipped on a dime. We certainly saw it, I think, I know as we hit the end of the rental report, as you well remember, the data, each time we got a new tranche of data, we had to go back and rewrite the story. So is that a story that seems to have changed? How does that relate to the kind of mobility rates as the vacancy rates, really plummeted?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there was a lot of attention paid to kind of rents going down kind of in that earlier part of the pandemic. And, that definitely did happen, but I was kind of skeptical of whether that was going to last, because there have been some things that fundamentally haven't changed, including, housing supply. We're definitely getting more housing supply on the market, as we've seen in the rental report, but just like a lot of things fundamentally haven't changed about supply and demand in this country for rental housing. And as we showed in the rental report, rents really rose phenomenally fast. So it could be that the kind of lower rents for a brief time earlier in the pandemic contributed to more moves. I am kind of confused about why that March 2021 spike shows up. The March 2020 spike makes a lot of sense, but the March 2021 spike is kind of like, okay, why is this happening? And that could have been more of that, because that was still pretty early in the pandemic. But then what we see after that, I think, is people who have found their place and are really trying to lock in their rents because they see rents rising so much around them.
Can you tell anything from this data, or do you have, if you don't have that, at least an intuitive feel about the extent to which moves are renters becoming homeowners versus renters who are moving from one rental to the next? I mean, we know that the home ownership, looks like the home ownership rate and the number of homeowners is going up. which would certainly be a move. Again, what do we know about that?
Yeah, that's been an interesting thing that we don't have as much data on, and I think that what I've seen has been kind of, with the CPS has been kind of contrary to what I would maybe expect in terms of some of the trends, because we see both renter mobility going down and homeowner mobility kind of remaining stagnant between 2019 and 2021. And I should note that when they're measuring a move, it's, what are you now, a homeowner or a renter, and did you move in the past year? So if you're a homeowner and you were recently a renter, you're just coded as a homeowner there. But that mobility rate didn't decline, but it didn't really increase. So I'm really interested to see in like the 2022 CPS if homeowner mobility increases because of the really hot housing market in the spring and summer of 2021, which was after the March CPS ASEC was collected. But other than that, we didn't really see in the kind of 2020 data for CPS this huge spike, even though in other data like the housing vacancy survey and stuff, we do see the number of homeowner households increasing and the number of renter households increasing as well.
Which again seems sort of odd. If both homeowner households are increasing and renter households are increasing, it seems like somebody had to move from someplace, and yet it doesn't. I guess I don't quite understand. I've never been able to quite figure out why that isn't showing up in higher mobility rates.
Yeah, and I think that it could be too. Again, I mentioned that the CPS was affected, during the pandemic in terms of data collection, and it's maybe representing kind of lower income adults less, and so that could also be part of it. But I think that we kind of have to connect these dots in interesting ways with both demographics and mobility, and see what future data shows us. I'm also really excited to see the 2021 ACS, which hopefully won't have the issues of the 2020 ACS, and allow us to kind of compare things over time to see where things stand.
Yep. Question here, which builds off of some of that interesting data that you showed about the kind of continuation of people leaving high cost areas for lower cost areas. Have you done that same analysis at the state level? So are we seeing kind of an outflow from high cost states? And I guess to a certain extent, can we disaggregate that from cold weather states?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have, and the state level analysis is similar to the metro level analysis, where we see the same places losing migrants as before the pandemic, and then the same places gaining migrants. So a lot of places that are gaining migrants are kind of the same as usual, like Texas, Florida, retirement states, Arizona, New Mexico, South Carolina, et cetera. And then a lot of the states that have been kind of losing places are both the kind of high cost colder states, so places people might be leaving for affordability, places people might be leaving for retirement, and those include kind of New York, California, Massachusetts, and some in the kind of upper Midwest as well, but that can sometimes be variable. So yeah, on the state level, we're seeing kind of a lot of those same pre-pandemic trends continuing into the pandemic.
This wasn't part of your presentation, but if I'm thinking about population and households, the other piece or another major piece of that puzzle is going to be immigration. And I don't know, at least historically, we know that immigration numbers overall are way down. But to what extent are those, I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit because it wasn't part of your presentation, but to what extent are immigration flows offsetting some of those population flows?
Yeah, so I'm trying to find, okay, here I have it. So I can kind of just reshare my screen here to show that this is one of my kind of bonus slides. So again, if you download the slides later, you can see what slides are after the talk. But it shows you, in terms of people moving from abroad, this went down from 4% of moves to about 2% of moves. The CBS, I wouldn't say is the best example of the kind of immigration data, but what we've seen is that immigration has gone way down. And I think that that's really going to affect a lot of population change in a lot of different places. There are places from, large high cost cities to, kind of small rural towns that have really depended on immigration for their population growth and for their workforce as well. And it's gone down actually since 2016, but then really sharply declined during the pandemic. And so I think we're going to start seeing in some of the data, the places that typically would either not be losing as much population or gain population when there's strong immigration, but now are losing population. I think we might see more places losing population because of that decline in immigration. And so I think that is a really interesting kind of demographic implication of this, that there's declining mobility overall, but then a kind of a separate thing is that immigration has been declining for different reasons. But it's definitely going to have big implications.
We have a bunch of questions about how changes in household formation rates and some of those patterns, some of which, as I think, pulling from Dan's blog, I know we've thought about. How are those seem to be affecting mobility rates?
Yeah, so that's the kind of puzzle that we've been kind of getting into about, like, where does this show up in mobility rates? And I think what could be happening is that household formation is going up, and this is kind of like a generational thing, right? So it's like more millennials kind of being in a position to form a household, but there's so many millennials overall that you see like levels maybe kind of increasing, but then rates still declining because there's more people who aren't moving. And so, yeah, I would definitely expect household formation to then be associated with moving. But I think that there's a lot of kind of other factors that are counteracting that, which is kind of what you saw in the kind of pandemic trends in general, when you saw the USPS data with like little, kind of increases in this month and that month, but then everything else is going to pre-pandemic trends. There's so many different factors that are influencing this that what you're looking for might be clouded by other factors.
Two interesting questions, trying to tease out a little bit of the data. One is, there's been a general trend of outmigration from rural communities prior to the pandemic. And I'm wondering, to what extent can you see if that trend has continued? Has it reversed? There was certainly that narrative, the narrative of again, New York, the New York story of New Yorkers moving to rural areas, or can we not really figure it out yet?
Yeah, so I think that there's an interesting thing that the Pew Research survey did here, and I didn't pay as much attention to it because I was kind of talking about this narrative between cities and suburbs that has been going on. But we actually see that there's been, during the pandemic, a little bit more net domestic migration from rural areas. And again, this is Pew Research Center analysis of the current population survey. And so that's been a really interesting thing, because you've seen both population change as rural areas get older, and then also domestic migration into and out of these places is different. And again, this is an interesting thing where you could put in international migration and find some interesting results about where immigrants are going in rural areas and what that's doing to kind of the population change in rural areas. But the available evidence to us has shown that it may have become a little bit more negative net outflow from rural areas, but overall it hasn't changed as dramatically for rural areas. But it is a really interesting analysis that I hope to do more of, since obviously
and interestingly, it seemed that data suggested that there was a slight inflow into, did I read that right, into rural areas pre-pandemic?
Pre-pandemic, yes.
Yeah. So a little bit
exactly.
that narrative.
But very barely. It was basically zero.
Yeah. Is there anything that you can say, sir? I know you can't do this from the Postal Service data, but at least from some of the historic data, about any differences, notable differences by race and ethnicity in migration patterns?
Yes. So I think that there's it is interesting, because I think that there's higher mobility rates among people of color, often I think maybe being a result of the kind of income difference in mobility rates and among people of color. And I think there's also, there have been some interesting things that we've seen in the ACS data, which I try to use more because it has kind of more reliable data to do this kind of cross tabulations about, for instance, Hispanic adults being more likely to live in multi-generational households and what that does to mobility rates and whether that decreases mobility rates or not. And so I think that there's some really interesting trends to kind of get into there. And also what we found and showed in the rental report and the State of the Nation's Housing Report is that people of color really were more financially affected by the pandemic. So I would be interested to kind of get into, especially ACS data again, to see what these effects were, because if CPS did indeed underrepresent and undersample, people who were lower income, and including maybe people who were like more mobile, because the CPS also is, there's a lot of things you could get into about how the CPS is conducted, but it's an optional survey on like the ACS, and there's oftentimes there are some analyses that says it doesn't adequately like capture the most kind of mobile part of the population as well. So I think that I would really look to ACS for a lot of the information, and I'm looking forward to doing so.
Yeah. So that actually leads me to my last question, which is when you get the next tranche of data, what are the 2 or 3 kind of big questions that you want to get at first, or at least once you've sort of cleaned up, the data? What are the big puzzles that you're hoping that, or the big questions about what's going to happen, what's happened that you're really focused on?
Yeah. I'm really interested in kind of getting more into this kind of geographical analysis, seeing these places that are, because again, I don't want to diminish the fact that moves during the pandemic have affected different places. And I think that, even if it's the case that it's like, oh, sure, this metro was gaining people before the pandemic and is still during the pandemic, that's still interesting. And it's still interesting to see, what effect that's having on that metro area. So yeah, I think getting into kind of more geographical analysis of like, how is population change and mobility interacting in rural areas, in suburbs, in cities, and what are we seeing there? And there's an interesting thing happening in cities too, which is that even though there's a net outflow from cities, young adults are still really concentrated in cities, which is Hyojung Lee, a former postdoc at JCHS, has done some really interesting research on that. So it's like, both narratives are true, that millennials are leaving cities and young adults are not, just as it's the case that, mobility is going down overall, but mobility during the pandemic has been high and has affected places. It's just that the kind of macro picture is different than that.
Well, I want to thank you. Just, this is wonderful work. I mean, I think you've probably run into this before. If you say mobility rates, like you're at a social gathering, people kind of look at you cross-eyed. And then I think what really struck me about your presentation is as soon as you start thinking about it, you start with anecdote, which is not data, right? And so we have different narratives of the people that we knew and the kind of worlds that we live in. And I think what's been so striking about the analyses that you've done, some of Dan's analysis earlier, is the extent to which either it turns out they're not true or they were true, but it was only temporary. So this is just wonderfully eye-opening. And as several people noted in the commentary, your ability to kind of go through a huge amount of information and present it in really clear ways that provoked a bunch of really terrific questions. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. Just is really wonderful. As you know, I've been digging a little bit into the Joint Center's history, and this has been something the center's always focused on, and you continue a long tradition of some terrific work. So thank you for the work. Thank you for a terrific presentation. And thank you everybody for joining us. We'll be back in 2 weeks with Jenny Schutz, and 6 days after that with the start of our symposium, and hope to at least see your names online, and looking forward to the day that we can see more of you in person, some of which will happen at the symposium. Thank you very much, Riordan, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for coming.